I almost didn't play Prey. Although I liked Arkane's Dishonored games, I wasn't necessarily sold on the pitch of Prey pre-release. I thought it looked interesting, but kind of derivative, maybe even a little cliché. BioShock in space was the general impression I had, and while I like BioShock and acknowledge its impact, I don't love it. I always thought the aesthetic was stronger than the gameplay, and I actively dislike the meandering level design. Prey looked like yet another game set in a remote location where mad science meets uncontrollable forces, leaving nearly everyone except the protagonist dead in a ruined facility as you fight aliens or monsters or robots or some combination of the three. In gaming terms, this is an ancient trope. Half-Life, Quake, Doom, System Shock, they all had this premise. And of course, there are plenty more recent examples, including BioShock, Dead Space, and the Doom reboots. Really, BioShock and Prey are both spiritual successors of System Shock, and especially System Shock 2, not just in a general sense, but in the specific adaptation of certain mechanics and tropes. Most of the mechanical trappings that Prey shares with BioShock are derived from the System Shock games. BioShock in Space was a reductive, reactionary label to put on Prey, but to be fair, it's also fairly accurate on the surface. It ends up being a helpful descriptor to people who played the earlier game. You're a protagonist with a mysterious past, making your way through a beautiful Art Deco-inspired environment in an isolated and inhospitable location using morally dubious technology to gain superpowers. BioShock takes place in a city at the bottom of the ocean. Prey takes place on a space station. Prey has neuromods. BioShock has plasmids. In BioShock, you take pictures of enemies to gain advantages fighting them. In Prey, you scan enemies to unlock intel and new abilities. Both games have audio logs, hacking minigames, flying robots, turrets. Both games have big twists that drastically alter your relationship with the plot and protagonist. There are a lot of similarities, but when actually playing the games, the differences become readily apparent. They began from the shared starting point of System Shock 2 and took wildly different lessons from it, resulting in profoundly different games. The System Shock games unquestionably belong to the immersive sim tradition, a style of game that's been far more influential than commercially popular. Immersive sims value systemic gameplay over scripted gameplay, an open-ended approach to progression, detailed environments, and a wide array of player abilities that result in emergent gameplay. Lots of games check some or all of those boxes, but only a handful are usually considered to be immersive sims. That's because it's less of a hard genre and more of a video game design movement, something that games and developers themselves signal alignment with through a shared collection of specific motifs and mechanics. The most well-known immersive sim shorthand being the inclusion of the passcode 451, or 0451, although plenty of games that are definitely not immersive sims have included that reference as well. BioShock achieved success and notoriety by distancing itself from immersive sim qualities. It's more linear and simplified compared to the System Shock games, but BioShock was marketed and self-identified as a shooter. Compared to immersive sims, it was simplistic, but compared to other contemporary shooters, it was impressively deep and complex. Complexity and depth have always been as much of a liability for immersive sims as an asset. By streamlining the mechanics from more complex games and wrapping them up with bold and dark visuals and themes, BioShock far outpaced the success of its predecessors and successors. The only Shock game more successful was the sequel, BioShock Infinite, which moved even farther away from immersive sim ideals. Following BioShock, there was a resurgence of the movement. Deus Ex Human Revolution and its sequel Mankind Divided, as well as Arkane's own Dishonored franchise, carried on a new, modern, and refined approach to the genre. There was even a forgotten Thief reboot, regarded as the weakest of the bunch. These games were of a slightly different immersive sim tradition than the System Shock branch. They divided their games into discrete levels, presented in linear order, instead of the System Shock approach of one large interconnected space that unlocks as the player progresses and gains abilities. Players of a certain age will tell you how amazing System Shock was in 1994, but that game, and even its 1999 sequel, are unapproachable for large portions of the modern gaming audience, myself included. It's the controls, the interface, and the basic quality of life assumptions that have atrophied, not the core design. That's what was carried forward and built upon by BioShock, Deus Ex, Dishonored, and especially Prey. Despite many surface similarities to BioShock, and genre harmony with Deus Ex and Dishonored, Prey was the first spiritual continuation of the System Shock design ethos in almost 2 decades. Unfortunately, that's a difficult thing to market. Prey did not get the warm reception of BioShock or even Dishonored. For the most part, it was well received critically, but with a few outlying lower scores that brought down the all-important average. More significantly, the game wasn't the commercial success that parent company ZeniMax was looking for. While hard sales numbers aren't easy to come by, Prey appears to have sold worse than Dishonored and the Deus Ex revivals, only beating out the poorly received Thief reboot. Developer Arkane Austin pivoted hard with their follow-up game Redfall, a co-op vampire-themed shooter with only the lightest traces of an immersive sim. Redfall was, by all accounts, an even bigger failure. A commercial failure, to be sure, but also an artistic and design failure. A significant portion of Prey's development team left during the making of Redfall, and a year after release, Microsoft closed Arkane Austin. Prey also had the additional baggage of a completely different franchise and genre. The first game, called Prey, was a 2006 shooter developed by Human Head Studios. The two games share nothing in common, except that you fight aliens in both games. Prey 2006 is entirely linear. It bears much more resemblance to something like Half-Life 2 than System Shock 2. Arkane's Prey wasn't a reboot. It was a completely unrelated project. Arkane was forced to use the name Prey for their game because ZeniMax owned the IP and wanted to capitalize on the existing brand, uncaring or ignorant of the fact that that would saddle the new game with mismatched expectations for a portion of the audience. I never played the 2006 game, I have no history and no baggage with it, but there were plenty of people who did, and were looking forward to its sequel before it was cancelled. Arkane had nothing to do with that cancellation, but by being forced to use the name, they were guilty by association. 2017 was also a particularly strong year for video games. With so many things going against it, and so much competition, how was Prey ever supposed to be some kind of breakout hit? Prey is a game that's almost tailor-made for me, my interests and sensibilities, and yet I almost made the mistake of ignoring it. I don't think I'm alone in that either. I've read dozens of anecdotes from players who either bounced off the game at first, or didn't get around to it until long after release, but wound up loving the game. Prey might have had a smaller audience than Arkane or ZeniMax wanted, but it did find a fervent fan base. On the surface, there isn't much that's novel or exclusive about Prey that I can point to as support for my assertion that it's incredibly special. It's a very traditional video game in so many ways, and a very traditional immersive sim. It doesn't hide or run from its influences. They're abundant and obvious if you know what you're looking at. Prey is special not because it's singularly unique or revolutionary. It's special because of how well it exemplifies that rare design template, and how it builds on it with numerous small choices and flourishes. The way that it brings its ideas together is harmonious, engaging, and fittingly, immersive. Prey's opening sequence ties together expertly done world building, tutorial, theme, narrative, and presentation. It's one of the best game introductions I've ever played. That's another trait it shares with BioShock, but by contrast, Prey demands more feedback from the player. BioShock shows you its dramatic revelations. Prey makes you pull the sheet off yourself. In a nutshell, that's the major difference between BioShock's more linear, guided design and Prey's player-driven approach. In Prey, you take on the role of Morgan Yu. You can choose either a male or female version, which is just a cosmetic difference, but it is in keeping with the game's commitment to player choice. Whether this particular choice is meaningful is up to each individual, but it's less mechanically and narratively consequential than almost any other choice given to the player. At the beginning of the game, Morgan Yu is caught in a time loop, seemingly living the same day over and over. A time loop inherently suggests a mystery. How did it start? Why does it perpetuate? How do you break the loop? A time loop would go on to be the central premise of Arkane's next game, Deathloop, but in Prey, there's no actual time loop. It only seems that way for Morgan because their memory is being continually reset. Protagonists of time loop stories are typically the only ones aware of the loop. Prey flips this on its head. Morgan is in the dark, but everyone else you meet is keenly aware of what's going on. For them, it's an elaborate ruse. The game could have run you through a couple of versions of the loop before breaking it, but that would have been tedious on repeat playthroughs, and more importantly, it would have broken the way that the game immerses you in the role of Morgan Yu. If you experienced multiple versions of the loop, that would give players knowledge that Morgan doesn't have. So the game forgoes repeating the loop, assuming the audience is genre savvy enough to pick up on things. You only see one day of the loop before beginning the game proper, because that's the point at which Morgan's memory stops getting reset. You wake up in Morgan's apartment in San Francisco. They're about to start a new position with their family's company, the TranStar Corporation. You take a helicopter ride across town to meet your brother Alex and prepare to leave for the company's research space station Talos I. As part of the preparations, you're subjected to a series of bizarre tests. This is elegantly multifunctional. On one level, it's teaching a few basic mechanical interactions, although it's possible to learn all of the same controls just by messing around in Morgan's apartment beforehand. Ultimately, the tests are less about the actions you perform than the mindset they cultivate. There are no wrong answers, which emphasizes the game's open-ended nature, but mostly, the tests are there to build the mystery. The sequence is just as vital for narrative setup as basic mechanical tutorial. The final test is a combination personality and ethics test. This has three simultaneous purposes. One, it ensures players know how to use computer screens, which are very prevalent throughout the game. Two, it plants the seed of a story point that players won't come to understand until much later. And three, it poses ethical dilemmas to the player that will be mirrored by situations you encounter later on. The end of the test is interrupted when an alien creature suddenly attacks and kills the lead researcher. Morgan is quickly knocked out, and you wake up back in your apartment as if nothing had happened. But this time, Morgan's memory wasn't wiped. You remember. Morgan remembers. Something is very wrong. Outside your apartment, the hallway has transformed into a scene of horror. There's a dead body in the dim, flickering light. At the end of the hall, where the elevator used to be, there's only a solid wall. There's no way out. But there's one helpful object, a wrench lying on the floor. Armed with that, you can return to the apartment and escape by shattering your balcony window. Except it's not a window. It's not a balcony. It's not an apartment building. The glass shatters, revealing the depth of the ruse you've been placed in. The apartment, the cityscape, the helicopter ride, it was all fake. They were elaborate transforming sets, augmented by a technology called Looking Glass, which projects an image based on the viewer's perspective, creating a convincing illusion of depth. The whole thing took place in a simulation lab with you as the rat running the maze. What I especially love about this twist and how it works is that the game leaves it to the player to uncover. It isn't a difficult puzzle. Once you acquire the wrench, it's only natural to start hitting things, and even if you don't immediately think of the intended solution, you're going to try it before long. The fact that you're not explicitly told what to do, but left to piece it together yourself, makes a huge difference to the psychological impact of the big moment. The first time I played the game, I missed the intended reveal. I was messing around, experimenting with the limits of the game and the engine, just hitting things with a wrench to see what kind of damage was modeled. Before I had a chance to break the glass in Morgan's apartment, I swung at the fish tank at the end of the hallway. I expected a crack decal to appear, or maybe a particle effect of water spilling out. Instead, I got a subtler version of the big reveal, because the fish tank is also a looking glass screen. You don't get the slow-motion glass break this way, it's less dramatic, but the sense of finding something secret was stronger. The simple fact that I had uncovered this major reveal by doing something so mundane was more exciting than a big flashy scripted action set piece would have been, and it befitted the game in front of me much better. There are some subtle hints about the true nature of what's going on, but nothing so obvious or direct that a first-time player would figure it out. There are scuff marks on the floor in the apartment building hallway where the wall moves during the fake elevator ride. In the room with the helicopter, you can see a strange series of glares coming from the sky. If a player notices at all, they might chalk it up to a rendering bug with the game itself, but this is actually light leaking through from the array of looking glass projectors above. Moving beyond the initial series of rooms, you come to a cavernous lobby. If you hadn't already figured it out, you're not even on Earth. You're already in space aboard Talos I. This sequence teaches you to be curious, suspicious, not to trust what's initially presented as the whole truth. You're encouraged to, and rewarded for, paying attention to detail, considering alternative perspectives and approaches. That's the right mindset for exploring Talos I and engaging with its story. This is where the game's demo ended. Having made an extremely strong first impression, I still wasn't convinced to play it, because this is also where the BioShock comparisons became inescapable. First, you inject yourself with a needle to get superpowers, then the ornate Art Deco flourishes of the lobby smack you in the face, and that hurt the game for me. I tend to think that BioShock's intro is its strongest sequence. It takes much of the runtime to get back to anything approaching those heights, and the end of that game is famously disappointing by comparison to the setup. Prey greatly impressed me with its introduction, but rather unfairly, that worked against my initial assessment of the game. Surely it wasn't going to live up to the expectations that were set. Hadn't I already seen the best part? Why bother with the full package? I'm glad I ignored that knee-jerk reaction. Even though Prey's introduction is fantastic, and no single moment is more memorable than that glass shattering, the game that follows does not disappoint. Although Prey might share some of its retro-inspired visual design with BioShock, Talos I and Rapture diverge wildly as playable, explorable spaces. Rapture is a captivating environment conceptually, but in practice, it's often a series of medium-sized rooms arbitrarily linked by nonsensical corridors. It's designed as a video game level much more than a practical space. BioShock Infinite was sometimes compared to walking through a theme park. The designers thought about sightlines and spectacle. Conversations and events pop off just as you walk by. It's built to give players concentrated stimuli, which does invite you into the world of the game, but in an obviously artificial way that stops working if the game's spell is broken. Not everything has to be presented naturalistically, but games that do convey a naturalistic sense of place are pretty special, because you can't really compare that experience with any other medium. The written word paints a picture in the reader's mind. Visual arts give vivid glimpses of limited angles, but the interactive medium of video games can grant the audience free rein to explore and probe fictional spaces at their own pace, satisfying their own curiosities. A good game location can be as memorable and beloved as a well-written character. Immersive sims usually have an excellent sense of place. Arkane's own Dishonored series, the Adam Jensen Deus Ex games, and even the Hitman series, which is sometimes seen as immersive sim adjacent, have wonderfully detailed and reactive sandbox levels, but those games spread themselves across discrete maps and missions. They're not logically self-contained. Arbitrary and artificial barriers keep you hemmed into the pieces of the world designed for play. You can't leave the fashion show in Hitman and go wander Paris. You can't take Samuel's boat anywhere you please in Dunwall. You can't cross these barriers in Human Revolution's Detroit. These limitations are a necessary part of games, but rubbing up against them like this sacrifices some of the immersion. Most of these levels also have empty, cheated space within them, areas that logically should be accessible given the player's toolset, but aren't. Doors that are just decoration, buildings that are just facades. Those are further compromises of the immersive ethos. Rapture, Columbia, Dunwall, Hingshaw, these are incredible video game environments, but more like suggestions of places. During Prey's development, Arkane referred to their level designers as level architects, which tells you something about the philosophy of building Talos I. It wasn't just a series of video game levels stapled together, it's a fully realized, self-contained fictional space. That's rare. By narrowing its scope to one facility, Prey is able to be detailed, open, and logically confined. The layout is comprehensible, and you can explore the entire thing through the course of the game. Every deck, every sector, every room if you have the right items or abilities. There are no false doors or artificially unreachable areas. When it seems like there might be, you can find an alternate way in, even if you have to go outside the station to reach it. Talos I is divided into 3 main decks consisting of several sectors each. The decks are connected by elevator for moving personnel, but also through a zero-gravity tunnel system known as the Guts, which is used for moving heavy cargo. You can also spacewalk outside the station, where there are a number of significant critical and optional points of interest. The elevator, the Guts, and spacewalking all function as immersive stand-ins for fast travel. They allow you to cover distance quickly using the exact same options that would be available to a person living on Talos I. The space station setting is a perfect in-world explanation for the game's limitations. Without access to a spacecraft, there's no logical expectation that you should be able to leave. If you stray far enough on a spacewalk, you start dying of radiation poisoning beyond the protection of the station's artificially generated magnetosphere. Spacewalking lets you appreciate how everything fits together. The exterior is almost exactly one-to-one in scale and configuration to the interior, which sounds obvious until you consider how many video games cheat with that sort of thing. The position of the hardware labs is not technically correct, which was done consciously to preserve the T-shape of the station, but the size and position of everything else is very close, if not exact. The Earth, Moon, Sun, and other objects move around with all the dynamic lighting changes that suggests. It's especially noticeable on the exterior of the station and in interior spaces with large windows. The relative position of the sun can drastically alter the mood of a given scene. This looks incredible using the HDR mod that I installed for this playthrough. Normally, when doing a critical examination of a game, I don't use mods that alter the original vision of the developers or fundamentally change the experience. But I don't consider adding HDR to be a drastic alteration of original intent. It simply allows the game to have the broader range of brightness values that spacebound games especially benefit from. The ultimate natural contrast between the brightness of a nearby star and the pitch-black void of space is able to be rendered a little closer to the real thing. The original Star Wars popularized the idea of a used future, giving us a glimpse of a spacefaring civilization that was beaten up, scuffed, and strewn with junk. That cluttered and dingy utilitarian look became the dominant mold of popular science fiction settings for reasons of theme and practicality. Prey further distinguishes itself from games with similar premises and settings by making Talos I nice. It's not cramped, dehumanizing, or depressing. Much of the station is spacious, inviting, even opulent. In place of endless gunmetal gray corridors, naturalistic materials, or facsimiles of them, dominate. Wood, stone, pure metals. Some areas are even carpeted. Apart from the ongoing containment disaster, it seems like a genuinely nice place to live and work in space, at least in terms of accommodations. Even the lower priority crew who only have small bunks instead of private cabins get to take advantage of beautiful common areas to eat, relax, and socialize. There's a gym, a theater, a bar, and a crew lounge. The Arboretum at the top of the station is this massive glass-domed area with plant life and simulated waterfalls where you can get out, see the sun, wander through a garden, and feel a bit closer to Earth. The environmental storytelling is top-notch. You can infer so much about life on the station just by exploring and observing. There's such a strong sense of lives that were lived, work that was done, and the disaster that disrupted all of that. Although the vast majority of the crew are dead by the time you begin, you're not running across anonymous, generic corpses. Every one of them has a name and assignment. The number of crew feels very plausible given the size and facilities available. Most of them have some degree of story that you can piece together, further filling in your picture of the whole. All of these design decisions add up to a palpable sense of believable immersion. Prey doesn't aim for realism in terms of perfect scientific accuracy or speculative fiction. There's a lot about the setting that's impractical from a strictly realistic point of view. But within the confines of its own premise, Prey is convincing because the world has been built out so thoroughly following its internal logic. The only thing that disrupts this immersive quality are the loading screens between areas. Seamless, invisible loading was becoming a trend in bigger budget games around this time. It's understandable for technical and design reasons that Prey was built without that feature. But if we could truly experience the station seamlessly, I think the immersive aspects of the game would have been even more appreciated. Talos I's design strikes a critical balance between utility and excess. This balance is key to its appeal as a space fantasy that the player can project themselves into. The mundane parts of the station provide a grounding for the more fantastical elements. As someone who loves the idea of living and working in space, this is a very tantalizing kind of escapism. I'll never get the chance to do anything like this for real. Nobody will. But it's a vivid portrait made all the more tangible by how you engage with the world. As a game, Prey is balanced between exploration and combat, with a greater emphasis on the former. All of it tilts on the axis of player choice and interest. How deeply a player wants to invest in either pillar, and what tools you want to use in furtherance of those ends is up to you. Those choices define the specific shape and texture of a given playthrough. Talos I has been overrun by the Typhon, a polymorphous alien species that serve as the primary threat. The Typhon are the reason for the station's construction in the first place. In the game's alternate history setting, the original core of Talos I was a Soviet satellite which became a containment facility after an unfortunate cosmonaut's fatal first contact. Following that, it became a joint venture between the American and Soviet governments until a containment breach forced it to be abandoned. Eventually, it was sold to the TranStar Corporation, who began research on the aliens, leading to the creation of neuromods. The look of the Typhon is somewhat inspired by Rorschach inkblot tests. This is explicitly clear in the introduction's test sequence and a few other places, and goes along with the game's neuroscientific themes. Their natural form seems to be shadowy, indistinct tangles of dark, fibrous material that can take shapes suitable to its environment. Thus, you get spider-like mimics, humanoid phantoms, and levitating telepaths. The Typhon have a variety of exotic abilities and an overall psychic effect on humans. Some of the crew, without direct contact or knowledge of the Typhon, were afflicted with dreams and visions of some dark and haunting presence. Telepaths exercise mind control over human thralls, while technopaths do essentially the same thing with machines, turning the station's defenses against you. Weavers are among the stranger forms of Typhon. Among other things, they're the source of the glowing web-like material known as coral that becomes more and more prevalent throughout the facility as the game goes on. Phantoms are created by weavers from human corpses. They seem to retain something of the original host, even when added to the Typhon collective. Phantoms have a variety of elemental abilities. Their speed makes them threatening foot soldiers. The humanoid form might lack for originality, but they make quite an impression for the way their presence causes electrical disturbances in the environment, creating dramatic light shows. The mid to late game introduces the Nightmare, a giant, extra powerful phantom created specifically to hunt and kill the player. It's the closest thing the game has to a boss fight, but the encounters are random and just as freeform as anything else in the game. You get a warning when one shows up. You can fight, you can run, or you can hide and wait for it to leave, but they always come back. The Nightmare is a good addition to the late game. It shakes things up and adds pressure, but it does so unevenly. If you've spec'd Morgan for direct combat, they're not too much of a problem, at least not by themselves. It's mostly a question of how many resources they'll lead up. But players with more fragile builds, or on the highest difficulties, probably feel the sense of dread that the Nightmare is meant to evoke more uniformly. Allowing a wide breadth of playstyles means that it would be sort of unfair and against the game's design principles to force combat with a high-level enemy. But running is too easy. If you leave the area you're in, the Nightmare despawns and leaves you alone for a while, which, depending on where and when they spawn, can severely undercut the menace. On the other end of the power spectrum is the game's most iconic and common enemy. Mimics, as their name suggests, can disguise themselves as ordinary objects hiding in plain sight until the moment they strike. It's startling when a nearby coffee mug or stack of paper suddenly morphs into an inky black spider and attacks. This creates the potential for little jump scares all over the game. But ultimately, mimics don't inspire the kind of dread you'd get in a horror game because they're not that dangerous. There's a little bit of a horror theme running through the game, but it's mostly an aesthetic rather than a dedicated goal of the game design. You become much too powerful for horror or dread to really permeate. Mimics themselves don't do much damage on their own, although multiple mimics are a problem early on when your weapon or ammo choices are limited. As enemies, they're more inconveniences than threats. Their true utility is to urge players to pay attention to the micro details of the environment, and to take things a little more slowly. It's possible to make educated guesses about what disguise a mimic is using, and sometimes get the drop on them. Look for unusual duplicate objects, or things that seem out of place. Once, I noticed a trash can rolling down a staircase. I looked up to see a suspicious extra trash can, which, sure enough, was a mimic. Getting jumped by them can be annoying, but paying just a little more attention to your surroundings often allows the player to turn the tables and hunt them instead. It keeps you on your toes and more aware of your surroundings. That's something you'll want to do anyway because the environment is littered with items, resources, interactive components, and storytelling devices. You can breeze through Prey's environments, zipping from objective to objective if you want, but you'll get so much less out of the game that way. Prey features a crafting system, hardly unique among video games of the time, but what makes this one so special is its distinct science fiction flair. Nearly every item can be recycled into basic material types, which can be used in fabricators, sort of advanced 3D printers. There's even a type of grenade called the Recycler Charge, which will suck nearby objects and enemies into a recycling field, transforming them into resource pellets. In space, resources are especially precious, even in an extravagantly furnished environment like Talos I. Being able to turn things back into their component parts, and then use those materials to create other items as needed, is a crafting system that fits the setting perfectly. There's an intended progression through the station, but the game doesn't feel confined or even especially linear. There are always optional areas to explore. Unlike some games, the barriers to your progress feel well justified and logical within the fiction. You emerge from the simulation lab with no credentials to get anywhere except your own office. Large portions of the station are on some form of lockdown due to the Typhon outbreak. Most of the game is spent increasing your access to the station, but at a few critical moments you'll be locked into or out of certain areas for plot reasons. Although the System Shock games were clearly a strong inspiration for Prey, Arkane took significant design cues from their own history. The concept of one sprawling, interconnected environment harkens back to their debut title, Arx Fatalis, a dungeon crawler that feels less like System Shock than it does the Ultima Underworld games, the primordial form of the immersive sim. This type of world design is functionally similar to the Metroidvania genre, a large interlocking environment broken up by different sectors and gated by abilities, equipment, or story progression. But that genre tends to have very game-like level design, and a stringent one-to-one relationship between lock and key. Prey's immersive sim approach is more flexible and internally logical, allowing and intending emergent gameplay through combining multiple tools and abilities. This is where Prey's gameplay shines brightest. In Prey, your skills and powers come from neuromods, which inject knowledge directly into the subject's brain. Neuromod augmentations are divided into two branches, human and Typhon. The human skill trees represent extensions of normal human abilities. These tend to be more grounded, practical, and passive. Things like health and inventory upgrades, or skills like hacking, repair, and weapons handling. The Typhon branch allows access to the powers and abilities of enemies, but only if you research them first. This means that basically anything an enemy can do, the player can learn and do themselves. There are some very powerful and wild abilities in the Typhon tree. You can even acquire the power of mimics, allowing you to transform into a wide variety of physics objects in the environment, to hide or get through small spaces. It's ridiculous rolling around as a coffee mug, but the development team ought to be commended for their audacious commitment to the idea. This must have been a technical nightmare to get working and try to debug. It's more of a novelty than a broadly useful power for most types of playthroughs, but it is in keeping with a rule established by the design team. If the enemy can do something, the player should also be able to get that ability. Choosing whether to spec with Typhon powers at all is a major mechanical choice in playstyle. The game warns you about going that direction, and there is an actual consequence. Choosing too many Typhon abilities causes the station's automated defenses to identify Morgan as a Typhon and attack you. Using certain Typhon powers around other humans will also cause them to turn hostile. I mean, in a universe where you're paranoid about alien shapeshifters, wouldn't you? You can also choose to forego any neuromods at all. Just like the Dishonored games, a no powers run is a completely viable alternative playstyle and self-imposed challenge. Whether you use neuromod powers or not, Prey has a robust set of tools and weapons besides. The least interesting are the standard guns. There are only two conventional firearms available, a pistol and a shotgun. It's far short of the complete arsenal that full first-person shooters provide, because combat is less of a focal point, and the setting doesn't really support having sniper rifles and machine guns around. Prey isn't trying to be a conventional shooter anyway. Shooting is just one of many verbs in the game, and often, you're not shooting bullets or buckshot. Energy weapons fulfill specialized roles. The stun gun is ideal against machines, but it can also knock out mind-controlled humans, allowing them to be saved instead of becoming collateral damage when fighting telepaths. The Q-beam is the heaviest weapon, great for engaging large, dangerous enemies at a distance. In general, you're fighting fewer enemies with longer intervals between combat encounters than a traditional FPS. The rhythm of the game is tilted in favor of the quiet moments of exploration. taking in environments, poking around, looting, learning. This is the bulk of the Prey experience, especially in the early and middle game. Combat is punctuation rather than propellant. That's why so many of the tools have multifaceted utility. If there's one signature tool, it's the glue cannon, a gun that shoots expanding adhesive globs. It's perhaps not as memorable as Half-Life 2's famed gravity gun, but like that venerable weapon, the glue cannon has many uses, in and out of combat. It can temporarily freeze enemies, making them more vulnerable, or allowing you to escape without a full engagement. Glue cannon ammo is easier to come by or fabricate than any other type, so it's very handy against the small cystoid fodder enemies that become common as the Typhon presence grows. The non-combat role of the glue cannon is what really cements it as a memorable part of the game. Its projectiles can seal leaks, extinguish fires, and stop electrical current. It can create barriers, walkways, ledges, and handholds. Glue globs can help you reach all sorts of otherwise inaccessible areas, provided you have the patience and creativity. On the other end of the spectrum is the Huntress Boltcaster, a fancy name for what's essentially a 3D printed Nerf gun. It's explicitly a toy in universe, something that the crew made and used for entertainment, but it does have utility. The bolts work on computer screens and buttons. This comes in handy when those things are physically out of reach. Like the glue cannon, you can also use it against cystoids, preserving ammo for your more potent weapons. While it doesn't have the usefulness of the other tools, it represents the kind of out-of-the-box thinking that immersive sims are known for. Player mobility is limited compared to some of Arkane's other games. There's no short-range teleportation power like in Dishonored or Deathloop, but compared to other immersive sims, you're fairly agile. You can mantle obstacles and easily climb ledges. You have a booster pack that helps you sustain jumps for short bursts or break a long fall. Prey's systems and mechanics combine with the world design to create a consistent and immersive setting with its own internal logic and rules. This is the baseline expectation for the genre, but Prey's execution of it is sublime. What makes it even better is how character, theme, and narrative are woven into these game design elements. One of the central recurring questions posed by the story is, who is Morgan Yu? There are two ways of answering that. One is by uncovering Morgan's predetermined history. Although this is vital context, the player has no say in it. You can't change your past, but you take an active role in piecing it together, interpreting it, and deciding what it means for present tense Morgan. How you proceed through the game determines the player-driven answer to the question. None of it is simplistic or straightforward. Prey is especially clever with how it identifies players with Morgan before revealing uncomfortable truths that might have otherwise made them less enthusiastic and sympathetic toward the protagonist. Something all forms of storytelling have to grapple with is the disparity between what the audience knows and what the characters know. In video games, this can be especially tricky when asking players to take on the role of a predefined protagonist. The difference in knowledge can drive a wedge between player and player character. Sometimes that's an intentional and valuable storytelling technique, but often placing the two in closer harmony is ideal for getting audience buy-in. Prey gets around the knowledge gap by having Morgan's memory reset to a point before any recent events of the story. While Morgan would still know a lot of things a first-time player wouldn't, erasing knowledge of the prior 3 years helps to place you together on the same blank page. The old amnesia cliche is used in many games for that reason, but here it feels especially well justified and integrated into the setting and themes. At first, Morgan appears to be a prisoner, placed in the experimental loop against their will, for who knows how long. You've been wronged, exploited in an especially violating way where you don't even realize what's happening until you've escaped. Clearly, Morgan is a special kind of victim. There's a strong incentive to find out why and hold somebody responsible. Later, it becomes clear that Morgan, the past Morgan, the pre-written one, consented to some amount of the experimentation, which made them vulnerable to being caught in the loop. But the player didn't choose that, and neither did the present Morgan. How can you even consent to something you don't realize is happening? Neuromods aren't just the game's excuse for superpowers, they're at the root of many elements of the plot, including Morgan's amnesia. The way neuromods work is inseparable from memory formation, meaning if you remove one, the subject's memory reverts back to the time when it was originally installed. Before the events of the game, Morgan volunteered to test Typhon-based neuromods for the first time. In order to start with a clean sheet, all of their existing neuromods were removed, which reset their memory back by 3 years. The intention was for Morgan to be kept apprised of the experiment's progress between each cycle of testing, but that stopped happening when Morgan's personality began to drift as a result of continued testing. Alex kept Morgan in testing, but without any debriefing between neuromod cycles, which put Morgan into the perceptual time loop. Morgan is genuinely a victim because of this, but that's far from the whole truth, because Morgan was also a perpetrator of some of the worst atrocities on the station. You're not an interloper in someone else's failed experiment. You're not a victim of a faceless evil corporation. You're the mad scientist. You're the callous executive. You've just forgotten. Imagine if you woke up one day to learn that you'd done horrible, unconscionable things of which you have no memory. It wasn't a drunken stupor. You did these things consciously, using all your faculties, for years. It couldn't have happened all at once. You probably slipped little by little into the downward moral spiral, justifying or ignoring the compromises, focused on some end game that might justify your choices, if only to yourself. Now you're confronted with these atrocities and the growing realization that you were responsible. This is the situation Prey challenges you with. You, the player, have no memory of committing these acts because, of course, you didn't. But Morgan doesn't remember either, and equally might not feel any culpability. Prey continues to align the player with the protagonist even after revealing a backstory that players might not have chosen and might not feel comfortable with. Human beings have the capacity to be wildly different people at different points in their lives. We change depending on circumstance, experience, belief. Without modifying the essence of a person, changing those variables can produce radically different outcomes. Whatever led Morgan to make their past choices has now been, at least partially, erased. Now the person Morgan was slams headfirst into the legacy of the person they became. What do you do? Time and time again, Prey presents you with a scenario and then pulls the rug out with additional information that recontextualizes things. They're not twists for the sake of cheap drama. Each one asks you to consider a new perspective without discarding the old one. By the end of the game, if you've been paying attention and engaging with the story, you'll have gotten glimpses of many perspectives. Rather than simplifying or solving the story with one final clue, the twists add complexity and nuance. What you decide to do with the information is what the game's biggest decisions are all about. You learn about past Morgan through the perspectives of others, your brother, the crew, communications left behind, and classic video game environmental storytelling. Strangest of all is the perspective of January, a robot Morgan left behind programmed specifically to help Morgan break out of the neuromod experiment and stop the Typhon. January speaks with Morgan's voice and claims to represent Morgan's true perspective. This is further complicated when you discover December, an older version of the January concept that has an entirely different set of recommendations. And there were other versions before that. Each one was a snapshot in time of a frantic Morgan trying to escape the loop and make contingency plans for the worst-case scenario. January's directive is to help Morgan destroy Talos I, a desperate measure to prevent the Typhon from reaching Earth. December is intended to help Morgan escape the station instead. The escape plan is treated as a failure state by the game. Leaving via Alex's private escape pod does give you an ending, but a false one. It's essentially a game over screen. You're not solving anything by running away. You're abdicating responsibility. You're choosing to do nothing, the most boring, cowardly choice. Perhaps December represents a more selfish, ignorant, or naive snapshot of Morgan, while the Morgan who created January was more conscientious, but pessimistic about the Typhon threat. Then there's Alex, your brother. He has his own perspective of the situation, and of Morgan. Alex seems like the game's obvious villain. He's the most morally compromised person, apart from the off-screen TranStar executive board. Everything Morgan is guilty of, Alex is more so. He's been at it longer and bears more responsibility. And of course, he kept Morgan trapped in that memory loop, which gives the player a personal reason to dislike and distrust him. Alex was a pretty shady manager of Talos I. He ran it like a shadowy, extrajudicial government organization. The station operated beyond the jurisdiction of any government, which TranStar took full advantage of. There seems to have been a general policy of compartmentalization and disinformation aboard the station. Many departments had no knowledge of the Typhon at all, and very few people seemed to have a complete picture of what was going on. Neuromods were used both as an incentive and a means of control. If sensitive information leaked to the wrong people, just wipe their memories by pulling their neuromods. Problem solved. But for all of this morally dubious history, Alex doesn't fit neatly into any video game villain stereotypes. He's not some charismatic bad guy popping in at major intervals to taunt you. Charismatic, sinister, or comedic villains were, and are, popular in mainstream games. They can be a big part of the enduring legacy of some titles. Prey sidesteps this in favor of something more nuanced. Alex is not a mustache-twirling bad guy. He's a deeply flawed individual, filled with human contradictions. He's your brother, and former, kind of literal, partner in crime. There's a genuine wistfulness in his voice when he talks about how Morgan used to be. He's functionally lost his sibling, but he hasn't given up on somehow fixing that. He doesn't want you to destroy the station. That's why he throws roadblocks in your way for much of the game. He'll try to stop Morgan from proceeding with either January or December's plans. At one point, he even locks you in an isolated section of the station, but he never means you any harm. He even provides genuine help and advice on several occasions. Keeping Morgan alive and unharmed is important to him. Eventually, Alex relents, stops hiding, and agrees to meet you. He also claims to be representing past Morgan's interests, and supports this with a recording of the two of you. He wants to find a way to neutralize the Typhon without destroying the station. This seems to have been the will of Morgan earlier in the timeline, before they determined that things were too dire for that. At this point, you can exact your vengeance on Alex if you're so inclined. You can kill him, or leave him for dead when a giant Typhon arrives to usher in the endgame. Or you can save him, either to work with him, or continue with different plans. Alex won't try to stop you if you decide on a different course, but he'll register his disappointment. His feelings are so strong that he'll remain on the station if you choose to destroy it. What to do with Talos I and the Typhon is the biggest single decision you make in Prey, but arguably, the better answer to the question, who is Morgan you, comes from how you deal with other survivors. In the opening test sequence, you're presented with a version of the trolley problem, the classic ethical dilemma. The game states it like this. A runaway train is bearing down on 5 people who are tied to the track. You can cause the train to switch tracks, but there is one person tied to the second track. It's been said that Prey as a whole is an exploration of that hypothetical, but that's an oversimplification. Most of the dilemmas you face don't neatly map onto the trolley problem. Really, it's the game's way of getting players thinking about ethical decision-making. Ethical dilemmas arise when otherwise sacrosanct moral norms come into conflict. It would obviously be wrong to switch the track without 5 people to save, but put those lives in the balance, and suddenly the same action takes on a different moral character, and so does inaction. Prey presents you with a number of moral and ethical conundrums. Most of them pertain to the surviving crew. This was a very exciting discovery on my first playthrough because, to return to the BioShock analog, I wasn't expecting to meet many NPCs during the game. The other principal characters in BioShock are non-interactive, encountered in cutscenes, over the radio, or behind glass. They perform their part in the play and then you move on. And Prey's introduction set the same kind of expectation. I thought the crew was going to be represented almost entirely in the past tense, but that's not the case. The fate of many crew members is directly in your hands. The bulk of the survivors are holed up in the cargo bay. When you finally arrive, it's a welcome break from the isolation. You can help them take back part of the station from the Typhon before moving on. Several crew will also engage you with minor side missions, but there's a lot more to interactions with NPCs than mere survival. Just like Arkane's Dishonored games, Prey cares about how you treat other humans. It's possible to have a completely pacifist run, preserving all human life you come across, even those who are outwardly hostile. BioShock also had moral choice as one of its major selling points. Do you murder these little girls to gain more of the game's most valuable resource, or do you free them from captivity and settle for slightly less? I mean, that is a choice, certainly. You get to choose your character's broad moral alignment, but as an ethical dilemma, it's not exactly a head-scratcher. It's not like Prey's central goal is to present you with the most agonizing moral quandaries, but all of them are more nuanced and complex than that. And most of the evil choices you can make have better rationalizations, lending them more weight. The game even defines evil for us. Alex explains that the Typhon have no mirror neurons, and therefore, in the game's construction, have no ability to empathize with the suffering of others. They're incapable of truly understanding what their actions mean for the victims. They're not evil, Alex insists. Implicit in his assessment is that humans who can empathize have moral agency, which allows, even necessitates, our immoral and unethical actions to be classified as evil. When the Typhon hurt and exploit their victims, they can't possibly understand. When humans do the same to each other, we're much worse than they could ever be, morally speaking. The concept of empathy is at the core of Prey's thematic exploration. Without empathy, the trolley problem is easy. It boils down to simple math. But the real world isn't so straightforward. The human experience is messier and more complex. Human beings also have the ability to rationalize their immoral behavior. We justify otherwise unacceptable actions through balancing tests with the greater good, societal norms, or personal beliefs. Something I appreciate about Prey is how it portrays human evil as a banal series of rationalizations, rather than the product of overt villainy. TranStar didn't start feeding people to aliens overnight. It took time to get the stew of moral repugnance to a boil. You find out just how bad things are on your way through the psychotronics sector. This is ground zero of Typhon research and neuromod manufacturing. Here, you find a man in a cell. He's what TranStar calls a volunteer. They were prisoners who opted to become research subjects on Talos I rather than serve out their sentences on Earth. They're promised eventual release, but that's definitely a lie. The volunteers were used to study the effects of the Typhon on humans, and as raw material. The man in the cell can be freed, left alone, or you can engage the equipment, which will place a mimic in the cell, killing him and reproducing more mimics, which are harvested for their exotic material, crucial in manufacturing neuromods. Here the game is asking whether you see this man as a human being or as raw material to be used to your best advantage. It's similar to the choice of whether to free or sacrifice little sisters in BioShock, but with a much greater degree of subtlety. For the player, it was hard to see little sisters as anything other than innocents. Killing them for Adam was the obviously evil choice. Here, the choice is laced with the kind of complications used to justify moral atrocity. This man doesn't have the innocence of a victimized child. You can read his rap sheet on a nearby terminal, assuming that it's factually true, and there are reasons to believe that it isn't. Do these crimes, or any crimes, justify feeding him to the Typhon? Even if you believe that he does deserve to die, isn't this method of execution cruel and unusual, and ultimately motivated by ulterior motives to justice? The criminal record isn't there to justify the act to a normal observer. It's there for the same reason that his name has been redacted and replaced with an ID number. These things help sand the edges off for the already morally compromised staff running the vile industrial process. The ID, instead of a name, obfuscates his humanity so that the staff can continue to believe that what they're doing isn't so bad. Maybe it's not bad at all. They're recycling the waste of humanity in furtherance of raising the ceiling of humanity's potential. You can justify almost anything with that line of thinking. The problem is, sometimes the greater good is a valid concern. Sometimes sacrifices are necessary. But how do you know when that's the case? The Space Shuttle Advent presents a more difficult quandary. 5 crew members departed the station just 30 minutes prior to the known start of the Typhon outbreak. They're about to land on Earth, but there's a good chance that mimics could have gotten on board before anyone became aware of the breach. You can remotely detonate the shuttle, killing everyone aboard, or allow it to land, risking a possible Typhon outbreak on Earth. There's no certainty about the threat. The only thing you can be certain of is the death of the crew if you push the button. There may or may not be a trolley, but if there is, it has the potential to run down a lot more than 5 people. Side missions in most games can be addressed at the player's convenience. There might be a sense of urgency in the scenario, but that's separate from any real consequence in gameplay. Not so in Prey. Several of the objectives, including your decision about the shuttle, are on a timer. They put you under some sort of pressure. None of the gameplay is especially difficult. Challenge isn't the point. The point is to force a decision. You can't leave and come back later. The problems confronting you are actually confrontational. 2 of the most significant crew members in need are Dr. Dio Igwe and Chief Systems Engineer Michaela Ilyushin. When he first contacts you, Dr. Igwe is adrift outside the station in a cargo container which is rapidly running out of oxygen. You have a limited time to figure out how to dock the container and safely release him onto the station. But you're free to ignore him, or even open the container in space, deliberately killing him. Chief Ilyushin suffers from a medical condition that would disqualify her from working in space had she not concealed it. This condition will prove fatal without the player's intervention. There's no on-screen timer for it. By this point, the game just expects the player to take urgent requests from NPCs seriously. If saved, Igwe and Ilyushin will make their way to Morgan's office, offering support, advice, and opinions. Together, they represent the 2 halves of the crew. Dr. Igwe was one of the station's top researchers. He represents the upper echelon who, by necessity, had to know the worst of Talos I's dirty secrets. Dr. Igwe is a true believer in the research and its ability to collectively better humanity despite the cost. Chief Ilyushin represents the blue-collar workers in charge of the station's basic operations. They were kept in the dark about how the sausage was made, or even that alien research was being done at all. Now that the truth of the Typhon has come to light, there's understandable tension between those who knew and those who didn't. Ilyushin regards Igwe as a bit of a monster for the things he's participated in. Her feelings toward Morgan are a little more complicated. Ilyushin got a job aboard Talos I to investigate what happened to her father, who disappeared after participating in TranStar's volunteer program. Her father was a political prisoner, not a hardened criminal. He must have seen volunteering as one of his only viable ways out of the Russian penal system. If you save Ilyushin, she asks Morgan to find out her father's fate. You already know what happened. He was sacrificed to a mimic to produce exotic material for neuromods. There's an audio recording of it. Even worse, Morgan was right there overseeing and authorizing the procedure. What makes this especially perverse is that Morgan and Ilyushin were briefly involved in a romantic relationship, but Morgan broke things off before engaging in the Typhon neuromod experiment, knowing they would forget everything anyway. Morgan almost certainly didn't know about Michaela's father. They simply didn't care enough to make the connection, or actively avoided thinking about the people they were sending to the slaughter. You can present your findings to Ilyushin or lie about it. On the one hand, she deserves to know. On the other, this isn't a great time for more emotional trauma. The recording is incredibly damning for Morgan, even if present Morgan didn't make that choice. It's very tempting to consider dodging the whole thing with a lie. If you send her the recording, she'll be justifiably angry, but she's ultimately convinced by January that current Morgan isn't the same person. Her forgiveness is incredibly magnanimous. Morgan did do those awful things. Not remembering their actions doesn't erase all culpability. And yet, being punished for something you don't remember doing and would not choose currently may also be seen as a kind of injustice. Ilyushin is determined to expose what TranStar has done, and she asks you for your help getting off the station with the incriminating evidence, as a demonstration that you're truly different from the person on the recording. By showing grace and forgiveness toward Morgan, while also seeking justice, she demonstrates the only positive way to end cycles of violence, vengeance, and exploitation. Not everyone is so understanding. One survivor is bent on revenge. In the crew quarters, the ship's cook has locked himself in the kitchen. He'll ask you to retrieve something from his cabin. This encounter, in contrast to nearly all the others, is meant to exploit the player's empathy and turn it against you. If you're too trusting without any discernment, you'll suffer for it. There's ample reason to find the scenario suspicious if you're paying attention. This guy isn't the real cook. He's a volunteer, a violent prisoner named Luka Golubkin who escaped in the chaos. At first, he feigns ignorance, but he's just biding his time. He knows who Morgan is, and he wants vengeance. After he unlocks the kitchen, you can knock him out or kill him, but to me, it doesn't feel thematically or dramatically appropriate to do that before he's shown his hand. If you choose to trust him, he'll trap you in the freezer with the bodies of other crew he's killed, instead of acting rationally and working with his fellow humans to survive the immediate threat. He's given into his malevolent nature and leveraged the crisis for his own selfish and sick ends. That feels especially violating. Unlike Ilyushin's father, Luka was a genuinely dangerous criminal. He was experimented on with a telepath, but the alien rejected Luka's warped mind, which seemed to cause additional psychological trauma. He was probably a real psychopath to begin with, but Alex and Morgan made him worse. By the time you escape the freezer, Luka is already gone, but his presence will haunt you for much of the game in the form of booby traps hidden around the station. Another survivor, Danielle Sho, asks you to hunt and kill him to avenge her lover. This is one of the only times in the game that killing another human is an explicit objective, despite the option always being available for any given NPC. That elevates the seriousness of the task. This is no time for humans to be turning on each other, but Luka broke that boundary first. When you finally locate Golubkin, he's bleeding out in a broken escape pod. He makes one final attempt to trick you into springing a trap that would kill you both, but you should be wise to that by now. I think it's best not to kill him. You don't even have to. He'll die no matter what, by your hand or his own. He does deserve it, but Morgan is the wrong executioner. More than anything, I felt sorry for him in this moment. A man at the end of his line, both perpetrator and victim, trying for one last stab at revenge, despite the fact that everyone on the station is most likely doomed anyway. In the end, he's more sad than frightening. Later, you're faced with a more cunning human adversary. The TranStar Board of Directors sends an operative, Walter Dahl, to take care of the crisis on the station. He's not there to help, of course. In the grand tradition of evil sci-fi research facilities, his orders are to recover valuable company property and exterminate the remaining survivors, even Alex and Morgan. Dal has high-level access to Talos I, and he turns the station against you, launching hostile military robots, which continually spawn throughout the episode. This really shakes things up and puts more pressure on you to fight or flee until Dal and his robot assistant are dealt with. Morgan and Dal have a cat and mouse dynamic. You can take some heat off yourself by deactivating your tracking bracelet, which will prevent him from actively knowing your location. But that doesn't mean you can ignore him. He'll threaten the crew, attempting to cut off oxygen to one of 3 locations. This starts another timed quest. Again, the game asks if you'll defer your own priorities to help others. During this time, you'll receive a distress call from a crew member named Luther Glass. Like the false cook, this is another trap designed to take advantage of the player's desire to help. Dal's deception here is much harder to detect, but there are a couple of minor red flags. Glass is supposedly trapped in the trauma center. Although optional, it's one of the most likely places for the player to have visited early on. If you did, you already found Glass's corpse, but it's not like players are able to keep track of all the names and bodies. Going to save Glass will trigger an ambush, revealing that he's long dead. Dal had cloned his voice for that distress call. Dal's presence on the station is so disruptive that it takes the focus off the Typhon. Killing him seems like the obvious and necessary play, but there are other options. If Dr. Igwe is alive, he'll suggest an alternate plan. Knock Dal unconscious, and Igwe can surgically remove his neuromods, resetting his memory. Then you can convince Dal to help the crew evacuate aboard his shuttle. It's a good plan. It's sort of delicious being able to flip the script on the whole neuromod memory manipulation thing. But now, you're wielding the same tools of deception and mental violation that you yourself were subject to in the opening of the game. It's for a good cause, and with the escape pods being deliberately non-functional, it's the only way to get the surviving crew off the station. If you don't do it, won't all your efforts to help them be in vain? It's easier to make this choice with Dal, a completely unsympathetic character, but the moral and ethical question still remains. Do you use awful means to achieve noble ends? Does the crisis justify what would normally be unacceptable? What constitutes a crisis, and who decides that? Is meeting an alien species for the first time such an existential crisis that it warrants morally unfettered scientific development? That was the calculus behind the Neuromod program. Neuromods are capable of incredible things. There are massive benefits that could better the lives of many. And now that the Typhon are a greater threat than ever, they present a way to augment humanity's ability to fight back and survive. The player has been using them the whole game and seen the tangible benefits firsthand. Now that you better understand the context and cost of it all, what will you do with that knowledge? Ultimately, you have to choose between the opposing viewpoints represented by January and Alex. Destroy Talos I, or preserve the station by neutralizing the Typhon. Burn it down because things have gone too far, the Typhon are too much of a threat, and Transtar too morally bankrupt. Or save what you can and learn from this experience. Make things better, safer, more ethical in the future. But don't throw out the good with the bad. Revolution or reform. The choice is yours. Although the overarching choice is binary, there are a lot of permutations in the details, depending on whether you saved the crew, sided with Dal, how you dealt with Alex in January, and whether you chose to escape the station or not. These things help an individual player's ending feel more personalized. All possibilities result in abrupt, equally unsatisfying cutscenes. It's a little disappointing after the nuance and complexity of the preceding game. It lacks a proper sense of closure and emotional weight. That's because it's not the real ending. In a post-credit sequence, Prey reveals its true ending, its final twist. you weren't playing as Morgan Yu after all. You were a Typhon experiment subject role-playing as Morgan in a simulation of events on Talos I. For some players, this is an extremely unwelcome revelation that ruins the story. Being told that nothing you did actually happened is too hard to swallow. In contrast to previous twists, this one seems to invalidate your choices with the new information. "It was all a simulation" is no different from the much maligned "it was all a dream" cliché, right? I don't think so. For one, that critique rests on the assumption that choices are only meaningful if they materially impact the plot and change something about it directly. And while that is often the most satisfying way for player choice to be implemented, it ignores the utility of choice as a role-playing, character-defining exercise. And that is explicitly how your choices are recontextualized in this ending. The main issue with "It Was All a Dream" is that it tends to render the preceding story meaningless. Prey doesn't do that. The twist exists to serve the broader narrative and underscore the game's most significant themes. The events of the game were a simulation, but that doesn't mean they have no relationship to what actually happened. The most significant part of the game turns out to be the totality of your choices. They might not matter materially, but they do psychologically. The preceding game must now be seen as a giant interactive test for the player character, a sprawling, immersive version of the one given at the beginning. Just like the opening twist, this one is also hinted at throughout the game. Not only do you get occasional glimpses of the reality beyond the simulation, you can also uncover information about something called Project Cobalt, a proposed research project to apply human-based neuromods to Typhon, which is what's happened to your character. You emerge from the simulation to see Alex, flanked by several robot operators, programmed with the memories of particular crew members. They judge you for your actions in the simulation. How did you treat the surviving crew? Did you act with empathy, indifference, even malice? Were you more like a Typhon with no ability to empathize? Or were you a compassionate player, willing to invest in the story, world, and characters? Whatever really happened on Talos I, the Typhon have now overrun the Earth. Alex survived, although there's no evidence anyone else did. This experiment is an attempt to save what remains of the world by building a bridge between Typhon and human. They've inserted mirror neurons into your character, hoping to enable the Typhon to experience empathy. The simulation was a way to cement the transplant and test the subject's capacity for human-like empathetic responses. Your choices were a reflection of the success or failure of that experiment. If you chose to play without regard for others, Alex and the operators kill you and start the experiment over with another subject. If you were helpful and compassionate, they free you, and you're allowed one final choice. You can take Alex's hand in friendship and begin to work toward peace, or you can exact vengeance by killing them all. Alex probably deserves to die for all the things he's done and sanctioned, but in a way, the simulation also serves as his confession. It's self-incriminating, just like the recording of Morgan and Michaela Ilyushin's father. To his credit, Alex presented you with a complicated picture of humanity, rather than a flattering self-portrait. The crew of Talos I is a broad cross-section, showing humans at their best, worst, and everything in between. Prey is not a didactic story. It could have been constructed to make a positive case for humanity. Instead, the simulation works by asking the subject on a more fundamental level to identify with humans, warts and all, and to have a human experience. Constructing an argument would miss the point. It isn't about logic, but feeling. Do you see us? Alex asks. That's the game's final question. It's not about logic or ethics or science fiction concepts. It's a personal question, a spiritual one. Prey isn't ultimately a story about fighting an alien menace. It's a story about trying to forge a connection between human and Typhon in a last-ditch effort to prevent the extinction of our species. That connection, if it is forged, must be forged with understanding, empathy, and forgiveness. To build a bridge requires looking past what they deserve to what could be if the hatchet was buried. It requires seeing intrinsic value where you saw none before. There are so many games, so many stories, where the fate of the world rests in the protagonist's hands. It seems like the ultimate high stakes in storytelling, but the world is ultimately an impersonal concept. It's too big to be relatable. That's why stories with high stakes still have to invest in small-scale relationships and everyday emotions in order to be resonant. Here too, Prey is clever with its use of this trope. It is about saving the world, or dooming it, but in a completely different way than expected, a much more personal way. A year after release, Arkane followed up a masterful single-player campaign with a roguelike-inspired add-on that was just as adept at reappropriating and remixing the mechanics of the base game. Prey Mooncrash is one of the best pieces of DLC I've ever played for how it creates a brilliant parallel experience to the main game, achieving that elusive balance of fresh and familiar. The main campaign cycles between narrative, exploration, and combat. It's often slower paced, especially in the early game when there are fewer enemies roaming Talos I. Your mileage will vary, but on standard difficulty, Prey can be a little on the easy side. I don't see that as a problem. If a game isn't challenging enough, that's what the higher difficulties are for. Prey even included additional difficulty toggles for things like weapon degradation and extra status effects, things that are baked into the Mooncrash experience. The main game is interested in exploration and storytelling, and the standard difficulty is tuned around those priorities. Mooncrash reverses that. It uses the immersive sim mold to build a survival action game, and that demands a higher level of adversity. Mooncrash is a consistently tense, occasionally frantic game that pushes the player to leverage systems and mechanics that you might have missed or ignored as Morgan. Prey wants you to have the freedom to play your way, to spec Morgan in whatever direction suits you. Mooncrash demands that you assume a wider variety of discrete playstyles in order to clear its objectives. You won't be as comfortable with some of them, but being comfortable runs against the intended sensations of a survival experience. Enemies are tougher, environmental hazards are more prevalent, managing resources is much trickier and is often the difference between success and failure. Mooncrash's run-based format makes the narrative, and even the exploration, subservient to the immediacy of the gameplay. There are story elements, it expands the universe of Prey a little, but it's not the focus. You play as an employee of Chasma, a rival company to TranStar. Your task is to do a little corporate espionage by data mining a simulation of TranStar's Pythias moonbase. This is all a framing device for Mooncrash's rule set, which is more artificial and game-like than the main campaign. Inside the simulation, you play as crew members who must escape the moonbase after the Typhon outbreak. You have a number of tasks to complete, which unlock new characters and options in subsequent runs. Your ultimate goal is to escape with all 5 characters in a single run. On that perfect run, nobody can die, and each character must use a different method of escape. Early runs are spent learning the layout of the base, and coming to grips with the particular mechanics of the mode. Pythias consists of 4 major zones. A large outdoor area, the crater, is surrounded by the other 3 sectors: Pythias Labs, the Crew Annex, and the Moonworks, a mining and industrial area. These sectors are arranged around the perimeter of the crater and connected to each other with a tram system, allowing convenient and safe travel so long as it remains functional. Unlike most roguelikes, Mooncrash's map is fixed rather than procedurally generated, but enemy and item distribution and base status effects are randomly determined. Each sector can have hazards like fires, radiation leaks, oxygen leaks, and power outages. These curveballs force you to adapt on the fly. Even though it's not the focus of the mode, exploration in Mooncrash is arguably nearly as good as in the main game, and it's even more valuable in some ways. Knowing the layout of the base can make all the difference. There are plenty of assets reused from Talos I, but they're remixed in a way that feels natural and still produces compelling environments. If Talos I is the fancy C-suite in the sky, Pythias is the blue-collar industrial plant on the ground, with a lot less of the ornate Art Deco styling that defined so much of the space station. Main areas of the base are divided by Typhon gates, electrical barriers that seal when aliens are nearby. You'll need to pass through them often. They're just as likely to trap you with the Typhon and force a confrontation as keep them at bay. The gates can be temporarily disabled using the stun gun. The strategic placement of these barriers and the danger of the enemy engagements makes the stun gun into an indispensable tool for Mooncrash. Although it allows you to escape combat, the time required to charge and shoot the gun, along with its short range, gives any pursuing enemies a window to attack. This creates little close calls all throughout runs. Individual runs operate on a timer, which bumps up the difficulty with every threshold. After 5 timer thresholds complete, you'll be ejected from the simulation and have to start a new run. The clock is always ticking, constantly adding pressure. This, even more than the increased enemy strength and environmental hazards, is the main source of tension in Mooncrash. Progression also increases the overall difficulty. As you achieve your goals and unlock characters, the simulation grows more corrupt and dangerous, introducing new rules, higher-level enemies, and bigger problems to deal with. Rather than having access to the full tree of unlockable powers like Morgan, each of the 5 playable characters represents a different build. Neuromod abilities are distributed among them, limiting your capabilities at any given time. Characters with the fanciest psionic powers tend to have less health and lack more practical abilities like hacking or repair. In fact, there's only one character with hacking abilities. There's only one who can repair things and enlarge their inventory. Those mundane abilities become increasingly useful as you get deeper into the progression. Mooncrash is uniquely demanding, even among run-based games, for the ways it asks players to improvise and roll with its many punches, but it's also surprisingly generous with what carries over between runs. Neuromod upgrades are permanent, so are unlockables like fabrication plans and chipsets. After completing a certain number of objectives, you unlock a robot companion with item storage shared by all characters within the same run, which is such a generous mechanic. Mooncrash is not interested in wasting your time slowly grinding out progression. Each run can meaningfully contribute to your overall goals. Nearly everything you do earns sim points, a currency used to purchase items, weapons, and other equipment between runs. This adds extra incentive during play. Even if your run is a failure, you'll still earn some points. If you play smart, you'll have more than enough sim points to help augment your loadout for any goal in the game. To achieve your ultimate goal, you need a plan, a strategy. What order do you play the different characters in? Which escape methods do you choose for each? What do you need to do with the earlier characters to set the later characters up for success? You need to wrap your head around the layout of the base, the strengths and weaknesses of each character, and the complications that may be thrown at you. Mooncrash is such a singular experience for the ways it twists both the roguelike and the immersive sim genres. It's very intense for an immersive sim, and very strategic for a roguelike. Sometimes it's an experience that I admire more than I enjoy, but it's such an unexpected and impressive follow-up to the base game. It clearly came from a studio at the height of its powers. It's such a shame what followed. I almost didn't play Prey. And I was a little afraid to replay it for fear that it wouldn't live up to my memories. I worried that I had built it up in my mind in the intervening years. I didn't. It's every bit as good as I remembered. It holds up to the scrutiny of a closer examination, revealing new depth and dimension. I love this game. I love Talos I, both as a video game environment and a fictional setting. I love how its technology looks and functions. The operators, grav shafts, recyclers, the computer interfaces. I love the melancholy atmosphere bolstered by the music from Mick Gordon, who came right off his seminal Doom 2016 score and produced something entirely different, but just as appropriate for this game as metal was for that. And I love Prey's rich themes and ideas. It's not truly about fighting aliens or saving the world or using superpowers. It's about what those things represent and how they affect our humanity. Prey is my favorite Arkane title, my favorite immersive sim. I'd argue that it's the best work the studio has yet produced, and the best example of the things that make it special. Or rather, made it special, since that particular location and team has long been dissolved. Fans of Prey 2017 are now in a similar position as fans of the 2006 Prey, waiting for a sequel that will probably never come. With Arkane Austin shut down, who would even pick up the mantle? We were never promised a sequel, unlike fans of the older game, but I expected the team who brought us Arkane's Prey to keep making games together. They were great at it. I don't mourn the Prey sequel that never was. Not everything needs a sequel. Not everything needs to be made into a sprawling franchise. Often that dilutes as much as expands an idea. What I mourn is the disillusion of that team, their talent, their experience, their passion, scattered to the winds. What I hope now is that Prey, like System Shock before it, will be recognized for what it is, and be a beacon of game design inspiration for future titles willing to carry on the immersive sim legacy. Something I found encouraging while working on this project is reading stories of players discovering the game for the first time and becoming fans, just like what's happened with those other older classics for decades. At the conclusion of his documentary on the making of Prey, NoClip's Danny O'Dwyer consoles game director Rafael Colantonio, telling him that he made a cult classic. But I think it's more than that. Prey is Arkane's understated masterpiece. It wasn't flashy, it didn't have the tailwinds of cultural zeitgeist behind it. On the surface, it looked like a giant pile of video game cliches. So many games have featured hostile alien enemies, life-altering speculative technologies, and dramatic player choice. Many have featured grueling ethical dilemmas and mind-bending plot twists. Few have engaged with those things as thoughtfully as Prey.